All right, everybody, welcome to episode number 4 of Basement Betak with me, your host Shahab. Today, I've got a special guest. He's a friend of mine from back in university days, Shuqaib Bhutto. Before I get him to say his hi and hellos, let me give you a little briefer कि ये है कौन. शुकैब से मैं मिला था यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ टेक्सास ऑस्टिन में back in I think it was 2000. If I'm wrong, Shuqaib, you will correct me. मैं पर्ड्यू में होता था इंडियाना में. मेरा इसका बड़ा भाई मेरा रूममेट हुआ करता था और मुझे समर में लेके गया था ये ऑस्टिन टेक्सास and that's where I met Shukaib, and then we instantaneously hit a chord, and we've kept in touch since. So what is it now, 24 years almost that we've been in touch. uh, और टुडे आज हम लोग जो एक एक वजह है मैं आज शुकेब को ले रहा हूँ. अब शुकेब को आप a lot of you who follow me on Twitter have actually seen him and have asked me to be on uh, हमारा WhatsApp group because I think a lot of you see the value in that Shukaib and a few others on that group bring. तो शुकेब का basically सारा चक्कर इस तरह है कि he is a business consultant by trade. Okay, but he's also a very astute and deep learner inside subjects like geopolitical analysis, yeah, on geopolitics, for example, and also on defense related matters. So a lot of times जब conflicts चल रही होती हैं, like अभी तो दो बड़ी चल रही हैं, यूक्रेन में चल रही है और पैलेस्टाइन में चल रही है. So I kind of leverage his knowledge on to try to make sense of what's going on, what's a bigger picture, and a lot of times Shakib and a few others on that group help me make sense of the world. So I don't want to belabor more credibility. I'll just tell you this much that इसने मुझे बहुत चीज़ें बताई है in the in the last 24 years that at the time looked sounded very absurd. But knowing Shakib, I never took him lightly. So ये कुछ कहता था मुझे और मैं फिर उस चीज़ को I would park it somewhere in the back of my mind and wait for the day when it would become a fact. Um, इसके मैं आपको typical सा example देता हूँ was the Millennium Challenge 2002. He told me about this back in 2004, I think it was. It was a little war game that the US had conducted to try and war game कि कल ईरान के साथ इनकी क्या conflict हो सकती है. तो इसने मुझे बताया था कि किस तरह battlefield shape हो सकता है. How a very conventional navy can be taken on by a very asymmetric and very small uh, uh, a naval force. I can't even call it naval force, frankly. It could be like rubber dinghy type thing. Uh, and believe it or not, this was back in 2004. And fast forward to 2024, and you're seeing that happen today in Yemen. Okay, so uh, uh, that's the kind of value that Shukaib brings, and I hope he can demonstrate that today. So without any further ado, welcome Shukaib, and how are you doing?
Uh, Thank you, Shahab. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast and thank you for your gracious introduction. Uh, yeah, I'll try to do the best that I can.
Yeah.
You and I have been discussing this particular scenario for close to 15 years now.
Hmm.
This Iran-Israel standoff. So uh, much. I mean, you've seen certain things which I knew to be true happen in front of you.
Yeah.
And when I used to say that it was going to happen or it was going to happen a particular way, I think you're one of the few people who actually believe me,
Hmm.
right? The rest were bought into uh, the typical propaganda that is floated out there
Hmm.
about, believing in high tech, magical tech, and the
Hmm.
supremacy of tech over tactics.
Correct.
And but we've seen something else recently, which has validated what I've been saying for a very long time. So
Yeah.
thank you once again for inviting me, and I hope that I give some value.
Absolutely. I think you're going to do a lot of justice to this show. And before we get into the topic, just let me give you a little briefer on the topic. हम करना ये चाह रहे हैं इस टॉपिक में. हम लोग इंग्लिश उर्दू में बात करते रहते हैं तो हम स्किप करेंगे. आई नो अ लॉट ऑफ पीपल मुझे कहते रहते हैं यार
Yeah.
उर्दू में करो, लेकिन जिस तरह हम लोग नॉर्मली बात करते हैं शुक्र है मैं वैसे ही रखूंगा. तो वी विल स्विच बिटवीन इंग्लिश एंड उर्दू. But the topic we have
All right.
for today, guys, is a lot of what you're seeing happen एक let's say एक नॉन कन्वेंशनल फोर्स लाइक हमास हो गया या अल कसाम हो गया या हिजबुल्लाह हो गया backed by a state actor or many state actors maybe taking on a very dominant force. Now why is this even happening? Why why are we seeing David challenge Goliath and taking them on so effectively? So to understand the conflict today, it's very important to have an understanding of the past. That how did these groups come into being? What does Iran have to? What's Iran's role in all of this? And Iran ki geopolitical strategy kya thi? You know, to understand the today of what they're dishing out to the Israelis, you have to understand where they're coming from. So I'm hoping in this episode with Shakib today, we're able to cover that timeline in a all of this 24 or let's say 3 decades of the development of Iran's military doctrine into what it's crystallizing as today. So Shakib, how would you like to begin this?
Okay. Uh, so, Shab, Iran has a long and incredible military history. That's besides their political, civilizational history. Their military history is superb. They, what you see in Iran today is a result of that to a large extent because typically your traditional Persians were never really impressed with the West. You can see this uh, in the way they fought the Roman Empire to a standstill, how they countered the Roman legions. Even before that, the way did they dealt with the Greeks, everybody else around them, and that has carried forward even today till this day. The Iranians aren't really intimidated or impressed by you know what the West has to threaten them with. And the reason for that is something we'll discuss when we talk about how the current military doctrine of Iran came to be. And there was one particular event, a very painful, a very bloody event, which has shaped Iran's psyche and its therefore its doctrine. And we'll begin by talking about that particular event. And of course, I'm talking about the Iran-Iraq War.
Hmm.
It was that it was that one long, bloody, useless conflict that has shaped the current Middle East because that was the learning ground where Iran ultimately developed or extracted its current doctrine from. And so let's just talk about that. Let's just begin by talking about that. I won't go into the reasons of why the revolution happened
Hmm.
because that is a separate topic and a very long discussion. But the result of the Iranian Revolution was that a lot of the Arab states around them started to feel a bit jittery about the new regime in Iran exporting the revolution. And one of those Arab states was Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Saddam felt that because uh, Shiism had acquired a state sponsor, therefore, sooner or later, the Shia in Iraq were going to uh, create an uprising, and Iran would intervene in the future to help them out. So he tried to preemptively sort of strike Iran under the guise of reclaiming Arab land, which is basically his target was the Khuzestan area, if I'm correct.
Hmm.
And Shah, please do correct me if I make a
Sure.
mistake. So he launched a preemptive war, maybe egged on by the West, by some Arab states, and it initially it went well. The first couple of months, the Iraqis were advancing because after the revolution, the Iranian defense establishment or setup was in turmoil. The old imperial Iranian officers had a lot of them had been sidelined or jailed, exiled, and when you take away the leadership of an army, you reduce its performance. So There was a lot of uncertainty when Iraq attacked. Matter of fact, that is what Saddam Hussein was trying to exploit. Uh, what ultimately happened was that the Iraqi attack got bogged down, and it got bogged down in the urban areas of Iran. And that is where the first lesson of the Iranian Revolution comes from. Because you see, when the Islamic Revolution happened there, the first thing the West did was impose sanctions. The Imperial Iranian army was heavily dependent on the West for spare parts because a lot of their weaponry was, in fact, Western. Matter of fact, I think all of it was Western, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
And Iran had everything from chieftains, which are British tanks, to F-14 Tomcats, which were the premier fighters of the US Navy. So when once the sanctions hit, those weapons started to degrade one way or another. Or let's just say that there was a bit of uh, uh, the Iranians just had to be careful in using them because a lack of spare parts meant that they would have to cannibalize a lot of the weapons. So there was a certain restraint put on their usage through the sanctions. But ultimately, the Iraqi attack kind of bogged down within months. And what reversed that attack was not some weaponry; it was in fact the Iranian infantry. You see, what happened was the Iraqi armored columns they advanced very swiftly through a lot of areas, but and the Iranians initially were thrown back, but they regrouped immediately. And uh, the most sort of zealous, uh, fanatical kind of fighters who were absolutely loyal to the new regime, they sort of stepped forward and they halted the Iraqi attack dead in its tracks by engaging it up close. They engaged it in very close quarter battles and they managed to repulse the Iraqi armor. So the very first lesson that Iran learned in that war was when everything else fails, जब हर system fail हो जाता है, हर weapon system, all these shiny toys, what actually works then is the human element. It is the individual warrior that steps up, and indeed that lesson has been proven time and again. Not just in the Iran-Iraq war. Take a look at what happened recently when the US had to leave Kabul. You know,
Yeah.
how many F-16s did the Taliban have? You know, how many Abrams did they have? They had nothing. They had light infantry. But when you combine dedicated, well-trained, well-equipped light infantry which has high morale and give it a purpose, and you combine it with even decent amount of weaponry, they get the job done. The Iranians were fighting for their homeland. The Iraqis were the aggressors. So the morale was on the Iranian side. So the first lesson they learned was focus on the individual infantry. Going forward, the war then bogged down into a very trench warfare, WW1 style trench warfare, where both sides settled along a certain boundary. But eventually, the Iranians did launch a massive sort of attack on Iraq in the hopes, I think, of capturing some of their sites inside Iraq. So the war now switched in the sense that the Iranians became the aggressors and the Iraqis were now on the defensive. And this is the period where you see wave after wave of Iranian human wave attacks, massive in scale, which went basically toe to toe against Iraqi infantry and their armored cavalry, so to speak. And this time, the Iranians actually managed to gain Iraqi territory. And then the Iraqis regrouped and they pushed them back. And once again, the World War One style trench warfare sort of set in. And this stalemate lasted a very long time. Now, by this time, the Iraqis were completely. Saddam Hussein knew that he had put his hand into a hornet's nest, and the hornets were now out to get him because uh, the leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, he refused any ceasefire attempts. I read an account of how the Saudis actually offered hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't know if that was accurate or not, to repay or recompense Iran for the losses they had suffered in in the war in exchange for a ceasefire. And Ayatollah Khomeini refused that.
Mm.
He just refused that completely. Anyway, so this was around it was around this time that the Scud War started. It's called the War of the Cities.
Mm.
Iraq acquired these Scuds from Soviet Union and started to bombard certain cities in Iran. And this was the one thing that actually worked, and it worked for a reason. Because a bit later down, the Iranians had no defense against the Iraqi attack. They had no way of stopping this attack on their population. And once Iraq acquired weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons from, ironically, the United States, then the balance changed completely. The first thing that Iraq did was Saddam Hussein wiped out a lot of the Marsh Arabs. It was basically like a weapons test that he did, and then he basically, like, it was putting two and two together for the Iranians, where they realized that, okay, this guy is now gonna do the same with us, where he's gonna mount chemical warheads on the Scuds, and we have no defense against it because Saddam Hussein was now terrified of what the Ayatollah wanted. Khomeini basically wanted Iraq. He wanted those holy sites which are so dear to the Tashi,
Mm.
which are located in Iraq. On top of that, the mounting fear of a Shiite revolution on the inside. So that one sort of weapon, the Scud mated with the chemical weapon warheads, was what ultimately convinced the Iranians to stop. So that was
Understood.
the second lesson. That was the second lesson that Iran learned, was that in a in a war like this, it is the side that is willing to take the most amount of pain and keep fighting back that will win. That's the key there. You have to be able to hit your opponent. It's not just about taking punishment. It's about taking punishment and dishing it out and being the last one to dish it out.
Okay.
In other words, they learned quickly what an escalation ladder is.
All right.
At that time, they had no idea how to respond to Iraq. No idea at all, because this combo was lethal for them. So Iraq could basically dominate the escalation ladder.
Yeah.
The Iranians could not possibly respond.
Yeah, they could respond to that. Yeah.
So the third, this was the second lesson they learned, was be able to hit your opponent and be able to be the last one to hit your opponent. There's a saying in boxing, Shah, between two fighters, there is a silent agreement. Right? So it goes something like this: I'll stop hurting you when you stop trying to win. That is a beautiful way of saying, of summarizing what an escalation ladder is. So often enough in a boxing match, you'll see that once fighter starts to dominate, but then he won't go for a kill unless the other fighter gets aggressive. Instead, the boxing match sort of coasts along, and I've seen this again and again in Muay Thai fights, Thai kickboxing fights, where for a fact one guy's going to win, and he refuses to knock out the other guy. They just coast along so that the audience gets a good show, you
Hmm.
know. And plus, they don't want to cripple each other, right? So
Yeah.
uh, the escalation ladder basically is something that the Iranians had to learn the hard way,
ठीक है.
what it is and how to dominate it.
सही.
Uh, in the Persian Gulf, there was something very interesting going on where each side went after each other's oil tankers. And the weapon that came out on top then were the gunboats from the Iranian side.
You're in the same Iran-Iraq war period, just जहाँ पे ये gunboats इस्तेमाल हो रही हैं?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Because again, the Iranian navy during the time of during the imperial reign of Shah Pahlavi
Mm-hmm.
was incredibly strong, but revolutionary Iran could not maintain a lot of the equipment.
Mm.
and they used what they have, and what was available to them were these gunboats which they could acquire.
Yeah.
So uh, coupling gunboats with anti-tank missiles and torpedoes, you know, they realized that this is actually a lethal weapon. And if you look at the geography of the Persian Gulf, it is a cul-de-sac.
Mm.
It has an opening, doesn't have an exit. The opening is the exit,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a relatively narrow sort of body,
Yeah.
you know. So in a place like that, this strategy actually works if you have the numbers and if you have some degree of support from the land,
Mm.
right? So the third lesson they learned was you don't have to invest in aircraft carriers,
Mm-hmm.
right? If a simple gunboat gets the job done, gunboat with four torpedoes gets the job done, what's the point of having an aircraft carrier? You don't need it.
Yeah.
Iran is right there. They can project their air power from a place like you know one of their ports.
Yeah.
They are not a naval power,
Mm.
and I don't think they have any desire to be. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah.
Again and again, Shah, what we learned from the Iran-Iraq war was that asymmetry kind of work.
Yeah.
You know, so uh, minefields played a huge role. Minefields dictated a lot of the ground warfare that happened between the two of them. So again, the lesson they learned there was about anti-access area denial type weaponry. Ditto for sea mines, you know,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And go for the right weaponry,
Okay.
right?
ठीक है.
It's not grand weaponry, not ego-based weapons.
Yeah.
Don't it's not high tech. It's the right tech.
Yeah.
That's what they learned.
Okay. That's the word they're
And
looking for.
again, the Shahid is a great example of that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It
So.
has a motorcycle engine. It kind of looks like a Vespa from Pakistan,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, but look at
How
how
effective
it
it
gets
is.
the job done.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So, Acha, interestingly, during the Iran-Iraq war, it was Iran which was dominant in the air
Mm.
to the point where they carried out one of the most spectacular aerial attacks in the history of aerial warfare. This was the attack on H3, the Iraqi airbase,
अच्छा.
H3, and they knocked out around 48 to 50 Iraqi planes in an instant.
Mm.
But they also sort of knew that this dominance wouldn't last long for the simple reason that they were running out of spare parts.
Yep.
Their main dominator was the F-14 Tomcat, and in a support role they had F-4s that they're called Tigers, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm.
And both are great planes. They both have different roles, but it wasn't going to last long. After the war, the Iranians started in earnest to achieve certain benchmarks. The first sort of the most eager thing they wanted was an ability to hit anybody in the region relatively accurately and repeatedly. What that means is they wanted a minimum quality ballistic missile, and they wanted it in numbers because uh, again, going back to the lesson they had learned, it was the Iraqi sort of blitz with their scuds on Iranian cities, which convinced Tehran to stop the war. And it was combined with the threat of chemical weapon,
Mm.
right?
Yep.
So this was one of the things they
That was pretty
wanted
much
to
the end of
achieve in
that was pretty much the end of the escalator ladder because now Iran knew
yeah,
कि अगर ये हमको chemical weapons मार दें इससे ज़्यादा हम क्या करेंगे.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah, because now Saddam Hussein was essentially threatening genocide, and he had shown he was capable of it,
Mm.
and nobody in the world was stopping him. Matter of fact,
They were encouraging it.
Rumsfeld,
Yeah.
yeah, Donald Rumsfeld was he went to Baghdad and he gave him some golden spurs, cowboy spurs,
Yeah.
made out of
Absolutely.
gold
Yep.
to encourage him to keep going,
Yep.
because he was a good boy at that time. Later on, he was a bad boy. At that time, he was defending democracy, I
Yeah.
guess. Anyway, uh, so they started rebuilding in earnest, and the first thing they wanted was a method of reaching out and touching their opponent in the worst way possible,
Mm.
and that involved acquiring a relatively accurate ballistic missile system in numbers. That is the
Mm.
key thing. Right. So, coming back to the first point, the infantry, they focused on getting the best possible weapon for their infantry.
Mm.
So, what you see today in terms of their anti-armor capabilities are shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles, which are second to none. They are absolutely A grade. Their their infantry-centric weaponry is really good.
Yeah.
There is no doubt about it, and they've they took that concept of focusing on the individual warrior and they basically layered it up into three places. One was internal, where they want to maintain order
Mm-hmm.
through having a huge amount of auxiliaries.
Mm.
Recently, when there was this uprising, there have been two or three, I think, in Iran, primarily in the urban centers.
Yeah.
It was the auxiliaries that stepped in and kind of controlled the crowd and maintained order. Not exactly sure what they're called, but I'm sure that we'll find out. Second was the regular army, yeah,
Okay.
and the regular army is pretty good, but they haven't been truly tested because the bulk of what Iran does now is under the control of the Revolutionary Guards of Iran,
Mm.
the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, and they are the they are at the top
Yeah.
of the food chain. So it is the IRGC which has dominance in their defense industries. It is the IRGC that maintains contact with their proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, in Afghanistan,
Mm.
and the IRGC dictates the strategy because it was the IRGC commanders who took the lead during the Iran-Iraq war.
Mm.
It was that time that they rose to the top.
ठीक है.
And again, coming back to the first point, how do you use infantry in an offensive manner? A ballistic missile can be fired and it can hit the enemy. How can you use infantry in an offensive manner without triggering a war?
Mm.
Well, Iran had a ready-made network in the sense that there are a lot of Shiite communities in the Middle East which have deep links with Iran through I think it's called the seminary system. There's a word for it. You will know. Hausa, is it? Right. So a lot of the community members would get educated in these Shiite seminaries,
Mm-hmm.
and when they would return to their communities, they would take that influence with them.
Yeah.
So it was a ready-made connection which the Iranian intel was able to exploit, combined with the fact that traditionally, because of historical reasons, I'm going to skirt for now. The Shiites in the region have felt like they were under siege. They felt like they had to be prepared at all times to defend themselves. So, through a process of natural sort of evolution or selection, they ended up acquiring the mountainous areas of the regions.
Mm.
The Houthis, for instance, if you notice, they are located in area which is
Yeah.
mountainous and rugged.
Yep.
The Shiites in Lebanon are primarily in the Bekaa Valley, if I'm not mistaken. Shiite allies who do not belong to the Twelver community, the Alawites, for instance, are also mountain-based people,
Yeah.
and a lot of the Iraqi Shiites originally used to live in the northeastern mountainous areas of Iraq before they kind of spread out.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a natural advantage because In mountainous areas, armor is very susceptible.
Yeah.
Once again, infantry prevails.
Yeah.
Acha. Uh, th- Iran, after the revolution, knew that uh, America and certain other Western countries would like to see them go away, the regime go away. So the regime decided
Mm.
that ultimately there would be a showdown somewhere with America and its allies. So as soon as the Iran-Iraq war ended, they started to prep for that eventuality. And one of the things they realized early on was they could not possibly fight them in the air. What they ended up doing was they evolved a strategy which basically called called for surviving the initial assault by from the air and then coming out and engaging the enemy close quarters. And this was a result of what they witnessed during the first Persian Gulf War, and or some people call it the second Persian Gulf War. They refer to the Iran-Iraq war as the first Persian Gulf War, right? So the war in Iraq against the first attack that America carried out to bring democracy to Kuwait, to the oil fields of Kuwait. That was the war that the Iranians observed very quickly, very quietly, and they quickly learned the lesson that there was no hope of Iran, matching air power with the West anytime soon. Uh, they had also learned this lesson, by the way, in through their proxy in Lebanon. You know, because throughout the Iran-Iraq war, Iran was also supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. And again, Hezbollah, they don't have any tanks, they don't have aircraft carriers, they don't have an air force. What they have is quality infantry, dedicated, high morale, very well trained, willing to die. Uh, but without learning the right lesson, it would get wiped out. So they evolved a grand strategy which called for surviving the initial air assault and then striking back at their opponent repeatedly. So they essentially learned how to survive uh, in an environment where the enemy had complete air dominance, because they had to be realistic at that time. They had nothing. They had to build it up. Right now, they may have a few surprises.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly sure what they have in terms of air defense, but and we'll come to this later. They're not relying on their air defense. They're actually relying on what I said earlier, their ability to deliver pain to their opponents in massive quantities and to do it for a very long time. That is what they're relying on. They are not necessarily relying on S-300s or their air force. They know for a fact their air force is going to get wiped out
Yeah.
if there is a general attack on Iran.
Yeah. So Shakib, two things. So I think they also, like you said, the second Persian Gulf War. That's how they learned, uh, you know, the importance of being able to absorb all that aerial supremacy that the West who or their adversary has. I think it's something also that I guess, reaffirmed with what happened in Afghanistan. कि किस तरह तालिबान मेल्ट
Yeah,
इन कर गए थे, when they saw,
yeah,
initially तो वो लोग अपने फ्लैंक्स पे खड़े रहे, लेकिन आई थिंक उस जमाने में मुल्ला उमर की तरफ से ऑर्डर आया था कि यार सब मेल्ट कर जाए, like people, all of their guys, they started leaving their what do you call them, their bases, and they just moved, like they just melted into the crowd. They stopped fighting. They just literally stopped fighting. And
yes,
it's only when the bombing ended and these guys started then moving equipment in and coming in and setting up bases there, फिर उन्होंने जाके अपनी मुहिम शुरू की. तो I think that was again uh, another precedent for Iran to understand कि यार, this is the best way to go about it.
okay, okay. So they reached out to these communities and they decided to activate them. Prime example is the Shiite community in Lebanon, which for decades had been kind of sidelined. You know, so the Iranian Revolution gave them some degree of hope, and Tehran started to back them up. Same thing for other communities, and this is actually what triggered the war. In ironically, this fear that Saddam had. So uh, the Iranians are very good at uh, learning the right lessons and applying them. They watched very carefully what America did to the Iraqi army in 1991. They realize fighting them right now in the air is almost impossible right now. Air to air, it cannot be done with the current tech that anybody has in this region. But they also realize that ultimately there has to be forces on the ground. जिसको boots on the ground कहते हैं, right? And once the boots come on the ground, then your boots come out. And that is what they focused on, was surviving the initial air assault and then engaging the enemy at dagger range, eyeball to eyeball. And they actually got to test this theory out both in Iraq and in the 2006 war in Lebanon, which was a watershed moment. People don't realize how important that war was. It was the, first of all, going back a little bit, Hezbollah uh, pulled off a complete surprise when they forced the Israeli army out of South Lebanon. The Israelis have never voluntarily withdrawn from anywhere. They've always been forced out. And coming back to Iran, uh, they had prepped Hezbollah correctly. In the 2006 war, Hezbollah basically waited for the initial air assault to peter out because they knew that sooner or later the Israelis have to come in.
Mm.
And as soon as they came in, they let them come in a little bit, and then the engagement started again, point blank. Uh, they also did something brilliant. They used ATGMs as sniper weapons, anti-infantry weapons, where they, instead of focusing on tanks, they would focus on the Israeli infantry. Right? They would ignore the tanks, and if there was infantry behind them, they would target the infantry with the anti-tank weapons. Something very interesting, and again, something Iran picked up on. So the first test of the current Iranian doctrine was the 2006 war.
Mm.
Acha, what happened in the 2006 war? Why it was so crucial? It was the first time that Israel was hit repeatedly. From start till the end, the Hezbollah missile or rocket assault came out to around, averaged out to around 200 or 300 missiles every day. And Israel had no answer for it. All they could do was destroy civilian infrastructure.
Mm.
That's all they could do was destroy everything in South Lebanon, make life as miserable as possible for the civilians, hoping that they would rise up against Hezbollah, but it backfired. It backfired spectacularly because Hezbollah had built up such a loyalty in the south and in the Bekaa Valley that it was almost impossible uh, for anybody to sort of force Hezbollah to be detached from the people there. And again, very valuable lessons that Iran picked up. A lot of their theories were validated, especially about the nature of the opponent they faced, or let's just say the opponents that they currently face. Because Shab, what I said earlier when we spoke on WhatsApp, for the Iranians, this is a game of pain,
Yeah.
right? The way they look at it, they can take the pain, but all those wonderful sand castles, spread throughout the region, and all those settlements built with U.S. taxpayer dollars. Uh, those the people living there, they can't take the pain the way the Iranians can. That is what the Iranians are counting on. Is that in this game of pain, they will come out on top for the simple reason that they are willing to.
Mm.
You know, ultimately. Shab, in a fight like this, it is the side that is willing to commit suicide that has the advantage. Speaking very
Mm.
brutally,
Yeah.
speaking very honestly, that is the truth. When
Yeah.
it comes to a do or die fight, honestly, it is the side that is willing to die that comes out on top. And the last 20 years, what we witnessed with the war of terror
Mm.
uh, is testimony to this fact. The
Yeah.
Talibs were willing to die.
Mm.
Right or wrong doesn't matter. They were willing to die for what they believed in,
Mm.
and keep doing it for 20 years. They were willing to do it. The Republican Guards, when Iraq was attacked in 2003, the Republican Guards basically dispersed, just like the Talibs. They dispersed and they started conducting this guerrilla war, IEDs, you know, EFPs, rocket, shoulder-fired RPGs, snipers. They kept bleeding the Western forces. Iranian militias also did the same thing: hit, run, hit, run, hit, run. But even in that scenario, hit and run, you have to be willing to lose everything.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to you know hit a it's like pulling a tiger's tail basically. America had the best military forces on the planet. You know, so if somebody pulls a tiger's tail, they better be willing to die. And a lot of them lost their lives, but in the end, look what happened. You know? Anyway,
Okay.
coming back to Iran, um, so the 2006 war was the first time that you can say very clearly that Israel lost, very clearly, because none of their political objectives were achieved. And
Mm.
we'll come back to this point with regards to the current situation in the Middle East,
Mm.
the attack by Iran. Well, we come back to this because there's some degree of confusion among some people about whether Iran's attack was a success or not,
Mm.
and they
Yeah.
try to obfuscate the issue
Downplay
by
it. Yeah.
presenting wrong metrics.
Yeah.
Yeah, they present the wrong metrics, a
Hmm.
straw man. I'll come back to this later.
Yeah.
And again, Iran's theory in 2006 was validated in the 2006 war. It was the Hezbollah infantry armed with the right weaponry, trained the correct way, knowing the lay of the land, having secure comms, and with a very high degree of indoctrination that essentially fought those 30,000 Israelis to a standstill. And pe- this is kind of unsubstantiated,
Hmm.
but at that time, Hezbollah had three brigades of around 5,000 each,
Yeah.
and only one brigade actually fought the war, start to end.
That's
Yeah. Um,
अच्छा ये
so
जो 2006 में हुआ था ये हिजबुल्लाह के साथ ये मेरे ख्याल से कोई ज़्यादा नहीं 4 से 6 हफ्ते चली थी जंग
33 days or 34 days,
33 days
depending on how you calculate it.
yeah okay and I think that was one of the most उस वक्त तक it was one of the most lengthy wars that Israel had fought
One of the most lengthy wars, yes, and
yeah
one of the most asymmetrical too. They
yeah
were not fighting a nation state.
exactly
So it was a complete surprise when it turned out that they had lost so many soldiers and around 48 to 54 tanks. I'm not exactly sure because they always
yeah
they never tell the real numbers, right?
yeah
So the Western armies are pretty good in conventional wars, and for the most part, they were oriented towards fighting Russia.
mm,
The Israelis followed a Western doctrine, a hybrid Western doctrine, hybrid in the sense that they came up with a lot of their own doctrine as well, for the situation, for the local environment. But again, their approach was decidedly Western, and so was their weakness. They cannot deal with unconventional fighting,
mm,
asymmetrical fighting. Hezbollah is a prime example of what an unconventional fighter can achieve against a conventional army.
mm,
And Iran looked at this very carefully. They drew the correct lessons and they applied them to the Houthis.
mm,
The lessons learned in that war, I remember reading a report that Hezbollah advisors after the war had traveled all over the place, advising different proxies in different areas, including Iraq.
Mm.
Some of them had gone to Syria to advise President Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah.
Sorry, at that time, I don't know if it was Bashar at that time. I'm not exactly clear if it was his father or it was him. But either way, they went to Syria and they started to advise the Syrian army on how to retake the Golan Heights. So again, Iran had learned the right lessons through observation, through whatever, and they had applied them.
Mm.
Uh, so we can fast forward now to the current day, and let's just talk about the Iranian Navy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So due to the particulars of the particular geography of the Persian Gulf, certain weapon systems are not required. Iran doesn't need aircraft carriers. It's right there.
Yeah.
You know, it's right there. What's the point? And it's not a naval expansionary power. It's not an expeditionary force.
Yeah.
So what's the point of having an aircraft carrier? They know for a fact that their destroyers won't survive for long
Yeah.
during a an all-out assault. But they also know that Western destroyers won't exactly survive either if they saturate the target with Exocet type anti-ship missile weaponry.
Yeah.
Because the one shiny weapon that was actually lethal on the Iraqi side was the Exocet.
Mm.
The French were supplying these missiles to the Iraqis, and the Iraqis actually made it work beautifully in some cases. And Iranians again, they didn't care who was teaching them the lesson. They just learned the lesson and they applied it. So now they have what thousands of anti-ship missiles,
Yeah.
land-based, mounted on gunboats, small gunboats which can sort of speedily maneuver everywhere. Right at the beginning of the podcast, Shahab, you brought up the Millennium Challenge.
Yeah.
To your audience listening to this, I would advise them, if they don't know already, look it up. Look up the Millennium Challenge and look at what Iranian Navy has in terms of equipment and their doctrine. And you'll see that that particular Marine general, that American Marine general, I think his name was Von Ripper or something. He knew his enemy. He had studied Iran, so he actually applied Iranian tactics and he won. And he was trying to warn his own people not to get overconfident, not to underestimate people on gunboats with torpedoes. You know, he was trying to say what I said earlier in the podcast. It is not high tech;
Mm.
it is the right tech.
Mm.
A Shahid landing on top of someone's head is just as lethal as a $1 million, fancy uh,
Yeah.
laser guided, GPS guided something something,
Yeah.
with quantum technology. Who cares? As long as it gets the job done, who
Yeah.
cares if it has a motorcycle engine in it? Yeah?
Yeah.
And to the point that they sold how many to the Russians? 15,000,
Oh yeah. They
10,000?
yeah बहुत सारे भेजे yeah. In fact,
Yeah,
मैंने
because
ये पढ़ा
it
था
is.
कि Iran might be setting up a manufacturing unit in Russia to produce those in
Yeah.
Russia.
Yeah. Everybody was laughing at this thing except me and maybe you.
Yeah.
And look at what it did. इसने जो तबाही मचाई है यूक्रेन में.
Mm.
So and again, this brings me back. It's not like Iran doesn't have quality weaponry. They
Mm.
do, but they also realize the advantage with numbers.
Yeah.
So they do the same thing with their infantry that they do with their cruise missiles.
Yeah.
And what they do is they have very high level infantry, which is used very strategically. And then they have your general line infantry, and that too is divided into two. One is the internal security apparatus, the other one guards the borders and maintains the border integrity and numerical strength. And the IHIC draws on them and they basically train them and utilize them the correct way. And that forms their elite
Mm.
core. Same thing with their weaponry. They have really cheap ass missiles like the Shahid Vespa Pajero,
Mhm.
and then they have really good quality missiles. which are top notch, and they're right up there with anything that anybody else has to offer, Russia, China, the West.
Yeah.
So it's a good balance. They don't rely exclusively on quality.
Yeah.
They understand that quantity has a quality of its own. And if anybody doubts that, then they should take a look at the fact that a $15,000 Shahid 2 has had to be brought down using a $100,000 interceptor.
Yeah.
And those Shahids which were intercepted by the Air Force along the way had to be shot down using AM-9 missiles, which cost what, 300, $400,000.
Yeah. Insane.
It's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
It reminds me of what they did with the F-22, where they downed those balloons.
Yeah.
Those
With an F-22, first skill.
with they downed those balloons with
Yeah.
God knows what kind of quantum weaponry. For God's
Yeah.
sakes, you got a gun, man.
Yeah.
Use your gun. What is wrong
Yeah.
with you, buddy?
Part 1 concludes.